All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Usually I don't need a mic because I've got a big mouth, but I'm fighting a cold, so this time I'm not going to scream. My name is William Roca. I'm the Director of Programs at Village Preservation. So thank you so much for turning out tonight. Who are Village Preservation members here? Y'all, thank you very much. Thank you. The rest of you, shame on you. You really should be members of Village Preservation. Please do become members of Village Preservation. Just head over to villagepreservation.org/donate, and then you can sign up and become a member. Also makes a great last-minute holiday gift as well. So just to tell you a little bit about Village Preservation, we've been protecting and talking about the cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, West Village, East Village, South Village, all the villages, and NoHo as well. Since 1980, we've helped designate over 1,250 buildings and have zoning protections for over 100 blocks. So we also promote, good development while trying to stop the not so good development. And we host over 75 free programs like this throughout the year. So that's why I always ask for members, because you, the members, help make this possible. So please do consider becoming a member, and as I said, great last-minute holiday gift. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, David Goodwin. He is the Assistant Director of the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University, and the past Frederick Lewis Allen Rooms Scholar at the New York Public Library. His first book, Left Bank of the Hudson, Jersey City and the Artists of 111 First Street, received the J. Owen Grundy History Award in 2018. He's also written for Gotham, a blog for scholars of New York City history, which is amazing. I love that blog. The Metropole, the Providence Journal, Sapiencia, and Urban Archive. So welcome, David Goodwin.
Thank you, William, for that warm introduction. Thank you to the entire team at Village Preservation for organizing this conversation tonight. Thank you, St. Mark's, for hosting us. And most of all, thank you all for sharing your evening with us, which is undoubtedly a busy time for you during the holiday season. Before I begin, I always ask, how many of you know who H.P. Lovecraft was? Does anyone have any favorite stories they'd like to share with the audience?
Mountains of Madness.
The Mountains of Madness, yes. Anyone else?
The
No?
Dunwich Horror.
What's that?
Yeah, the Dunwich Horror.
The Dunwich Horror? Anyone else like to share their favorite Lovecraft tale with the collected audience? No? Okay. So again, my name is David Goodwin. I'm the Assistant Director at the Center on Religion and Culture at Fordham University, and I'm the author of the new book, Midnight Rambles, H.P. Lovecraft in Gotham, which will serve as the anchor of our conversation tonight. The book will be on sale afterwards, so it makes a great stocking stuffer for those looking for a last-minute Christmas gift for friends. I'm really excited to be here in St. Mark's. This institution has a very storied, has a long history supporting the arts, so I'm glad that I can be a small part of that tradition. Readers primarily associate H.P. Lovecraft with his native Providence in New England. And that city and region serve as the setting for many of his better stories. However, tonight we're going to talk about a long overlooked chapter in Lovecraft's biography, that being his 2 years living and writing in New York City between 1924 and 1926. In our discussion tonight, we'll meet some of the people whom Lovecraft knew while living in New York. We'll visit some of the places which Lovecraft discovered while living in New York, and we'll analyze some of the stories which Lovecraft wrote while living in New York. Lovecraft himself described his time in New York as largely lost years. However, I hope our conversation tonight and my book will demonstrate otherwise, and reveal that his time in the city was integral to his development as a writer and as an individual. And we want this to be a conversation tonight. I'm going to talk for 45, 50 minutes, and then we're going to open up for questions from you, our audience. Next slide. So although I opened up by asking if everyone knew who Lovecraft was, I'm going to offer a short biography for the uninitiated. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born in 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, to Winfield Scott Lovecraft and Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft. Next slide. Much of his early life was marked by turmoil, loss, and sadness. In 1893, before Lovecraft was even 3 years old, his father, Winfield Scott, so that's the gentleman on the right side of the photograph on the screen, suffered a violent psychotic breakdown while in Chicago on a business trip. He was transported back to Providence under restraint and under sedation and committed to Butler Hospital, a mental health facility in that city. Winfield Scott Lovecraft died there as a patient in 1898. In all likelihood, his son, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, never saw his father after he passed through the hospital doors. After his father's institutionalization, Lovecraft and his mother moved into the mansion of his paternal grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips, a well-to-do businessman and real estate speculator. Lovecraft was raised in relative comfort until his grandfather's death in 1904. At that point, the family was forced to sell the home and the estate. Also at that point, Lovecraft and his mother then moved into an apartment in a two-family home in Providence. Lovecraft attended school on and off throughout his childhood and adolescence. Later, he would cite mental and physical maladies as the reason for his sparse attendance, and there's some question whether those were legitimate medical issues or they were psychosomatic. Ultimately, Lovecraft left school, never having earned a high school degree. This lack of a formal education was always a badge of shame for Lovecraft, and he obfuscated about this fact with acquaintances and friends. Next slide. In 1913, Lovecraft became involved in the amateur journalism movement. Today, the amateur journalism movement is little known. However, there are some modern corollaries, that being the zine movement in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, and I believe a new show opened about zines in the Brooklyn Museum, or the early days of blogging in the 2000s and 2010s. And I apologize, I should have prefaced that with the description of what amateur journalism was. Amateur journalism was an international organization of writers, editors, and publishers exchanging works in journals. Lovecraft developed a reputation within amateur journalism movement, and his involvement within it allowed him to build a far-flung network of correspondence and also to build the confidence to begin composing original fiction. If you'll notice, this cartoon we're looking at, this is from the Zenith, which was a magazine published in Brooklyn. This is an advertisement for the National Convention of the United Amateur Press Association in Boston, Massachusetts in July 1921. If you look at that cartoon closely, you'll see there's a caricature of Lovecraft on the left-hand side. Next slide. And you'll see that caricature is entitled Lovecraft Laughing. So this tells us that by 1921, Lovecraft was a very well-regarded, very well-liked, and a well-respected person within the amateur journalism movement. Also that he had a reputation as a serious, but not too serious individual within it. In 1919, Lovecraft's mother, Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft, was committed to Butler Hospital. This is the same institution where his father was a patient, in the same institution where his father died. She died in Butler Hospital in 1921. Throughout his adult life, Lovecraft lived off a meager inheritance, supplemented by freelance editing and writing projects. He made little money off his own original fiction, and he died nearly penniless in 1937. Also at that point, he had effectively stopped writing. In recent years, as Lovecraft's popularity has grown, and as new audiences have discovered his work, more attention, and rightly so, has been paid to his very dark, very real, and unfortunately very consistent views on race, ethnicity, and immigration, and how they might have shaped his fiction. Now, there is no separating the art from the artist. However, I would contend that an honest look at Lovecraft's biography reveals a very complex and a very contradictory individual. We will see this as we walk through his New York years. We will especially see this We compare his stated beliefs against his choice of personal relations. Next slide. So what did Lovecraft write? Where did he write? Lovecraft published his stories in pulp magazines in the 1920s and 1930s. He wrote science fiction stories, he wrote fantasy stories, he wrote horror stories, and he blended together elements from all these genres to create his own unique literary tradition, which today we would know as cosmic horror. Lovecraft is most famously known for a series of loosely interlocking short stories and novellas, collectively entitled the Cthulhu Mythos. Now, it's worth pointing out that Lovecraft himself never used that term. It was coined by readers and enthusiasts after his death in 1937. Several stories falling within the Cthulhu Mythos canon we already talked about tonight, such as At the Mountains of Madness, the Dunwich Horror. Of course, Lovecraft's most famous and iconic story, the Call of Cthulhu. In the Cthulhu Mythos tales, the protagonists or narrators, invariably solitary, scholarly gentlemen, such as archaeologists, librarians, or scientists, happen upon the knowledge of the existence of alien creatures and human beings in their service. These extraterrestrial entities once lorded over the earth, and now they are returning. Their second coming heralds the end of mankind. All the fruits of civilization, art, religion, culture, will be wiped out. In Lovecraft's fictional worldview is extremely bleak and extremely nihilistic. There is no hope. There are no happy endings. And I would just like to pause for a moment to talk about this cover image of Weird Tales. Weird Tales was Lovecraft's preferred venue for his fiction. This is the October 1937 issue of Weird Tales. Lovecraft's short story, The Shunned House, which he wrote while living in New York City, was first published in this particular issue. And this was several months after his death in March 1937. Next slide. I'm willing to state that Lovecraft is the most influential genre writer of the 20th and now the 21st century. We see the effect and legacy of his work seeping into both popular and high culture. Next slide. This is artwork commemorating the 30th anniversary of Ride the Lightning, an album by the seminal heavy metal band Metallica. On that album is an instrumental track entitled The Call of Cthulhu. This is referencing Lovecraft's short story, The Call of Cthulhu. So we hear Lovecraft in music. Next slide. We also see Lovecraft in television and film. This is a poster for the 1982 movie, The Thing, directed by John Carpenter. The story, or the plot of The Thing, drew heavily from At the Mountains of Madness, which we already talked about tonight. Next slide. We find Lovecraft in comic books. This is an illustration for Arkham Asylum, the institution which ineptly houses the villains in the Batman comics, television shows, and films. Arkham Asylum is referencing Arkham, Massachusetts, a fictional setting in Lovecraft's stories. In Lovecraft's Cthulhu Mythos tales, once the narrators or protagonists uncover the knowledge of these all-powerful, all-malevolent alien beings and the human beings operating as their servants, they begin to see these entities manipulating events throughout their contemporary world. This parallels our experience with Lovecraft's fiction. Once we encounter Lovecraft's works, especially his Cthulhu Mythos works, we begin to detect their legacy across the cultural landscape. Next slide. My book, Midnight Rambles, relied heavily on primary sources, specifically the letters of H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft was a prolific and compulsive letter writer. While living in New York City, he wrote almost daily letters to his two aunts living in Providence. Those letters total nearly 250,000 words. If you would like to learn more about Lovecraft after our conversation tonight, I strongly urge you to spend some time with his letters. The bulk of his letters are held at the John Hay Library at Brown University. Many of those letters are digitized and available for your review. Also, a small New York publisher, Hippocampus Press, has released multiple volumes of Lovecraft's letters over the last decade or so. The page we're looking at right now is from a letter by Lovecraft to Richard L.E. Morse, a poet and one-time librarian at Princeton University. The collection of Lovecraft's letters to Morse are held at the New York Public Library, so if you would like to see some original letters, you have an opportunity not far from here to do that. Next slide. And I chose this letter because of the illustration within it. This is 66 College Street. This was Lovecraft's final home in Providence. Incidentally, at that time, 66 College Street stood right next door to the John Hay Library, which would ultimately be the repository of Lovecraft's papers. They didn't know that at that time, neither did Lovecraft. This house was moved, I believe, in the 1950s to Prospect Street in Providence. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is the subject which has likely drawn many of you to St. Mark's this evening, that being Lovecraft in New York City. Lovecraft first visited New York in April 1922 to meet several longtime correspondents. His reaction to New York matched that of many first-time visitors. He marveled at the size and scale of Manhattan. He was infected by its energy and bustle, and he feasted on the bounty of cultural treasures in the city. Admittedly, he expressed very real disgust and discomfort with the swirl of diversity and immigration which he found in New York City. I'd like to share Lovecraft's impressions of the Manhattan skyline upon seeing it from his train seat. Quote, "I saw for the first time the cyclopean outlines of New York. It was a mystical sight in the gold sun of late afternoon. A dream thing of faint gray, outlined against a sky of faint gray smoke. City and sky were so alike that one could hardly be sure there was a city, that the fancy towers and pinnacles were not the merest illusions." End quote. Next slide, please. As mentioned, Lovecraft made the most of New York's cultural treasures during his first visit to the city in April 1922. Lovecraft was a devotee of the poet and short story writer and one-time New York resident, Edgar Allan Poe, so a pilgrimage to the Poe Cottage in the Bronx was a must for Lovecraft. Today, the Poe Cottage is just off the Grand Concourse, and I believe it is open to the public, although I haven't yet to find my way there. This photograph commemorates or captures Lovecraft's visit to the Poe Cottage. Lovecraft is standing at the center of the image. On his left is Frank Belknap Long, a lifelong New Yorker who would carve out his own career as a writer and would later pen a memoir exploring his friendship with Lovecraft. Long also married a woman who came from a prominent Yiddish theater family. On Lovecraft's right is James Ferdinand Morton. Morton would go on to become the first curator of the Patterson Museum in Patterson, New Jersey. Morton was also a committed activist fighting for civil rights for Black and Jewish Americans. So here we are seeing that contradiction between Lovecraft's beliefs and his choice of friends. Lovecraft would count both Long and Morton to be trusted and true friends until his death in 1937. Next slide. While in New York, Lovecraft was excited to see a copy of this magazine, Homebrew, on a subway newsstand. Homebrew was an amateur journalism periodical, so again, that's the movement we were talking about earlier tonight. Based in Brooklyn, it was a humor magazine, and it was published by a lawyer named George Julian Houtan. In the spring of 1922, Homebrew was carrying a series of 6 stories by Lovecraft, collectively entitled Gruesome Tales. We now know these as Herbert West Reanimator. Lovecraft was paid the princely sum of $5 per story, and he joked that his writing for Homebrew was, quote, unimaginative hackwork, end quote. So we're going to jump forward 2 years to 1924. On March 2nd, 1924, without providing friends or family any real explanation, Lovecraft suddenly moved to New York. Why? Why, we might ask ourselves. Well, why do many of us move to a new town, a new city, or even a new country? To chase after a romantic partner. Next slide. Lovecraft came to New York City to wed this woman, Sonia Green. Green could very well represent the most glaring and puzzling contradiction of Lovecraft. Green was a Ukrainian Jewish immigrant working in the city's fashion industry. She was a trained milliner or hat maker. Yiddish was her first language, and she was not a United States citizen at this time. In the spring of 1924, Green was living in an apartment at 259 Parkside Avenue in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and she owned a small hat shop in the neighborhood. When Lovecraft first visited New York in the spring of 1922, he stayed in the city as Green's house guest. Next slide. This is the only surviving photograph of Lovecraft and Green together. This was taken in the summer of 1921 at the Amateur Journalism Convention in Boston, which we talked about earlier. We don't know terribly much about the contours of their courtship and engagement. Lovecraft was never entirely forthcoming with his friends, and Green destroyed all her letters from Lovecraft in the 1930s. I did attempt to piece together the clues which I could find in Lovecraft's letters to recreate a narrative of the early days of the relationship. If you read my book, I hope you find that it convincing. At the very least, I hope you find it entertaining. Next slide. On March 3rd, 1924, so a single day after Lovecraft arrived in New York City, he and Green were wed at St. Paul's Chapel, an Episcopal church in Lower Manhattan. This was not Green's first marriage. She was a widow and had an adult daughter. Green wanted to have a civil ceremony. Lovecraft insisted on a proper church wedding. Although an avowed materialist and atheist, Lovecraft found value in tradition and history. St. Paul's provided both. Lovecraft's parents were married at an Episcopal church in Boston, and St. Paul's is the oldest house of worship on the island of Manhattan, counting our first president, George Washington, as a past parishioner. Next slide. After the wedding, Lovecraft and Green traveled to Philadelphia for a short honeymoon. They spent much of their time in the city of brotherly love, retranscribing a story Lovecraft was writing for Harry Houdini, and that is the famous magician and escape artist Harry Houdini for Weird Tales. Lovecraft lost his manuscript of the story while rushing through Providence Union Station to board his train taking him to New York and taking him to Sonia Green. This story was eventually published as Imprisoned with the Pharaohs in Weird Tales. Today we know it as Under the Pyramids. Lovecraft shared a collegial professional relationship with Houdini until the magician's death in 1926. At that time, Lovecraft was collaborating with a fellow Providence writer, C.M. Eddy, on a book for Houdini entitled The Cancer of Superstition. This volume aimed to debunk all manner of magical and superstitious thinking. The manuscript of The Cancer of Superstition was only found several years ago in 2016. Next slide. The first months of Green and Lovecraft's marriage were happy ones. The couple began building a home together in Green's Flatbush apartment. Lovecraft dreamed of achieving literary success in New York City. The couple enjoyed going to the movies, dining in Italian restaurants, and attending plays. Favorite pastime of the two was reading together in Prospect Park. Their preferred spot was the Vale of Cashmere, which we're looking at right now on the screen. Today, I believe the Vale of Cashmere is popular with bird watchers. However, by the end of the summer, the couple's fortunes took a marked downturn. Green's hat shop in Flatbush went out of business. Lovecraft had little luck breaking into the publishing world. He had little luck finding any work, for that matter. Green suffered through a series of mental and health issues, and the couple began selling their furniture and household goods to meet their daily needs. Clearly, this was not a tenable situation. Next slide. On December 31st, 1924, Sonia Green left New York City to take a job at a Cincinnati, Ohio department store. Lovecraft began renting a room in Brooklyn Heights. Of course, Green wanted her husband to relocate to Ohio with her. However, Lovecraft elected to remain in New York to be near his friends and continue to chase after the writing life. Lovecraft and Green would never live together again as man and wife, and the relationship effectively became a long-distance one. When Lovecraft moved into Brooklyn Heights in late December 1924, he described the neighborhood as, quote, a region of brick and brownstone within sight of the sea and with an old world air of musty stateliness, end quote. And this, admittedly, was a rose-tinted view of the neighborhood. By 1924 or 1925, Brooklyn Heights had been the first suburb of New York City, and it had been the province of the borough's affluent and elite individuals and families. However, by 1925, the neighborhood's once regal row homes and mansions were being chopped up into small apartments and rooming houses. Next slide. Where did Lovecraft live in Brooklyn Heights? Lovecraft was a tenant at 169 Clinton Street, which is the building on the left-hand side of this photograph. His room was on the corner of the second floor overlooking the intersection of Clinton and State Streets. Lovecraft described his room as, quote, a pleasing hermitage, end quote. However, as the months progressed, his feelings on the building and on Brooklyn and New York soured. In his letters, we see him complaining about the lack of hot water in the building, the heating in the building, his fellow tenants, his landlady. So for anyone that's been a renter in New York, this might sound like a very familiar refrain. In a rather humorous episode in May 1925, burglars broke into Lovecraft's room while he was napping and stole nearly all of his clothes. Lovecraft's experiences at Clinton Street contributed to his growing physical or almost visceral hatred toward New York City. However, things were not all bad for Lovecraft at Clinton Street or in Brooklyn or in New York. A good friend of his, a bookseller named George Kirk, rented a room directly above him for a period in 1925, and the two men would communicate with one another by banging on their radiator pipes. So I'm sure their fellow tenants enjoyed that in the late hours and the early morning hours. Another good friend of his, a poet named Samuel Loveman, lived within walking distance. During this period, Lovecraft became the central figure in a literary circle called the Calum Club. This group would meet every week, and Lovecraft would share part of almost every day with one member of another. This was easily the most sociable time of his life, and the only time when he belonged to a true bohemian circle. Never again would Lovecraft possess such a gift of ready access to friends. Next slide. So what was Lovecraft doing while his wife was working in Ohio? Being a writer, he spent an inordinate amount of time in diners and automats, cafes and coffee shops. A favorite of Lovecraft and his friends was the Double R Coffee House. The Double R was owned by the direct descendants of President Teddy Roosevelt. President Teddy Roosevelt. And it operates several locations in Manhattan. The favorite haunt of Lovecraft and his friends was the West 44th Street location in Midtown. One of the many reasons I love talking with groups such as yourself tonight is it allows me to share material or information which I couldn't shoehorn into my book. And one such item was this cartoon. I love this illustration. I think it captures what many of us might imagine the ideal writing life would have been in New York in the 1920s and 30s. We see people holding court, we see people talking, we see people, of course, writing. Notice on the left-hand side, there are caddies labeled writing material. Also notice beneath the coffee grinders, there's a small lending library, and this was maintained for the more lettered clientele of the Double R. The Double R was popular with more than just writers in the 1920s. In the 1920s and the 1930s, many all-night eateries and cafes served as safe spaces for queer men and women. The Double R carried such a reputation. How do we know this? Lovecraft's friend, George Kirk, whom we met a little bit earlier tonight, stated as much in a letter to his fiancée. Kirk wrote, quote, "If you had been longer in New York City, you know that there are many boys and many girls, both male and female. My dear Double R is claimed to be a hangout for these half-and-halfers," end quote. And there were queer men in Lovecraft's extended social circle, including the poet Hart Crane, best known for his work The Bridge, and, next slide, Lovecraft's dear friend Samuel Loveman, who we met earlier. Does anyone recognize the building Loveman is standing in front of? No? That's the same building Lovecraft is standing in front of on the cover of my book. That building was 259 Parkside Avenue. That was Sonia Green's apartment building. Both the photograph of Lovecraft and Loveman were taken during Lovecraft's first visit to New York in April 1922. I suspect both these photographs were taken on the same day. Next slide. When Lovecraft wasn't whiling away off hours in coffee shops, he was exploring New York. Lovecraft was fanatically obsessed with colonial and early American architecture and material culture. He was a committed Anglophile, and he believed that the 18th century represented the apex of the English-speaking world. He scoured the 5 boroughs and the entire metropolitan region for buildings, for gardens, or for spaces dating from that time or embodying its aesthetics. Lovecraft looked to these buildings and spaces to establish a physical, a creative, and dare say, spiritual connection to his idealized past. Lovecraft's favorite neighborhood for such architectural wanderings was Greenwich Village. This is a photograph of Gay Street in the village. Lovecraft declared Gay Street to be, quote, the soul of the 18th century. And Lovecraft's favorite time for such explorations was, quote, the sinister hours before dawn, when only cats, criminals, astronomers, and poetic antiquarians roam the waking world, end quote. Lovecraft relished these midnight rambles, and I apologize for the shameless product placement I keep weaving in, because they allowed him to experience a city with minimal intrusions from the modern world. And one of those primary intrusions for Lovecraft was the city's minority immigrant populations. He liked to walk the streets at night because there were fewer people out, and fewer people he did not want to encounter, or he did not feel belong in his idealized New York City. Next slide. So we're just going to spend a few minutes wandering through Greenwich Village, or lingering in it for a moment with Lovecraft. This is a painting by John Sloan. This work, I would suspect, captures the image of Greenwich Village in the 1920s, which many of us hold in our own minds. That is a neighborhood of light and laughter, art and literature, excitement and adventure. This was not the Greenwich Village that Lovecraft experienced. This was not the Greenwich Village which Lovecraft sought. Lovecraft did not visit Greenwich Village to rub shoulders with painters or debate poets. He visited Greenwich Village to gaze at its architecture and to absorb its aura of history. Next slide. And we're just going to walk through Greenwich Village and explore some of Lovecraft's favorite sites for a second. These are 2 photographs of Charlton Street. Lovecraft first wandered along this thoroughfare in 1924, and here's how he remembered that experience. Quote, how can I describe it? It was perfection. Little old New York, the New York of the 1780s, surviving in full and amazing splendor, with gleaming white doorways, polished knockers, jaunty dormer windows reflecting the sunset, and quaint gables enticingly silhouetted against the purpling east with its background of smoke. The past incarnate, end quote. Next slide. On another ramble through Greenwich Village, Lovecraft discovered Milligan Place. Milligan Place is a pocket community on 6th Avenue between 10th and 11th Streets. And this is the impression Milligan Place left upon Lovecraft's imagination. Quote, buried deep in the entrails of nondescript commercial blocks, this little lost world of a century and a quarter ago sleeps unheeding of the throng. Having seen this thing, one cannot look at an ordinary crowded street without wondering what surviving marvels may lurk unsuspected behind the prim and monotonous blocks, end quote. Next slide. This is a pair of photographs of the second cemetery of the Congregation Sharif Israel. This is on 11th Street, just off 6th Avenue. I know that I've walked by many a times without even stopping to admire it. I imagine many of you have done that as well. But I can assure you Lovecraft did not make that mistake. When he spied the cemetery, this is what he saw when he looked through its gates. Quote, at one place a spectral surprise lurks. A clump of pallid slabs and shafts salutes the eye, a wan bit of isolated and deserted burying ground. The stones are in English, and most of the startling Paleogean quality of the elder one is absent, end quote. And it's worth pausing for a moment and just thinking about the words that Lovecraft used. We see him expressing a perverse comfort in the fact that he could not detect Hebrew lettering on the headstones or the memorials in the cemetery. So we see Lovecraft's prejudices polluting his memories of New York and even shaping his interpretation or reading of architecture and places. Next slide. Many of you are probably asking yourself, did Lovecraft visit St. Mark's while living in New York? And the answer to that is yes. He declared St. Mark's to be, quote, a colonial oasis, end quote. Next slide. When Lovecraft was not holding court in coffee shops and when he wasn't wandering aimlessly through the streets of Greenwich Village, he was writing. Lovecraft composed a total of 5 stories while living in New York City. Although this was not his most prolific period, his time in New York shaped his imagination and helped him develop the literary vision, which we find in his best fiction. For instance, only by living in New York was Lovecraft able to perceive his native New England with its geography, its history, and its folkways as integral to his identity as a writer and as an individual. Next slide. This is the first page of the manuscript of the horror, Red Hook. Oh, we got it. This is the first page of, sorry, I said jump ahead too soon. This is the first page of the manuscript of the horror, Red Hook. The manuscript of the story is held at New York Public Library. Lovecraft wrote the horror, Red Hook, in August 1925. The horror, Red Hook might represent Lovecraft's most problematic piece of writing and offer the strongest evidence of his racist and xenophobic beliefs, polluting his fiction. The plot of the story centers around a New York City police detective, Thomas Malone, who stumbles upon a cult operating along the Brooklyn waterfront and its adjacent neighborhoods. Malone soon discovers that the reach of this cult spans the entire globe and that it is led by Robert Soydam, an eccentric descendant of an old Dutch family. The cult members are almost exclusively immigrants, and Lovecraft utilizes racist imagery and language to describe them and clearly position them as the other. The horror at Red Hook distilled Lovecraft's disgust with a diverse, multicultural city, and he labeled it, quote, my brief hymn of hate, end quote. Next slide. Although a flawed story, the horror at Red Hook does contain interesting narrative elements. It is a blend of the detective and horror genres. Also within it, we see Lovecraft experimenting with elements or techniques which became foundational to his conception of cosmic horror and his Cthulhu mythos tales. One being the inclusion of a realistic setting. The horror Red Hook was set in a real, recognizable New York City, and Lovecraft peppered the story with geographical and historical details to provide with a sense of authenticity for its readers. For example, the antagonist, the cult leader Robert Soydam, lives in Flatbush, Brooklyn, and he's married in the Flatbush Dutch Reformed Church. In the real world, that is our flesh and blood world, the burial ground of the Flatbush Dutch Reformed Church contains several headstones bearing the Soydam name. And the Soydam family indeed was once prominent in mercantile and real estate circles in New York City. Next slide. Another story Lovecraft wrote while living in New York was He. To be precise, He was written in a park in Elizabeth, New Jersey, which is a small industrial city. Elizabeth, New Jersey, which is a small industrial city on the Newark Bay, about a 10 to 20 minute train ride from Penn Station. He captured Lovecraft's sense of failure and frustration with his life in New York City. The story is told by an unnamed narrator, a poet and native New Englander who regrets his move to the city, stating, quote, my coming to New York had been a mistake, end quote. This narrator begins to seek consolation by taking nighttime strolls through Greenwich Village. This clearly resembles Lovecraft's mentality at the time of the composition of He. On one of his nighttime explorations, the narrator crosses paths with a stranger wearing 18th century clothing and speaking in a similarly antiquated manner. This stranger promises to reveal hitherto unknown architectural and historic treasures to the narrator. Eventually, the stranger reveals a vision of a future New York, that being a city completely overrun by immigrants and non-white people. Much like the horror Red Hook, he communicated Lovecraft's fear and loathing of immigrants, non-white races, and the other. Next slide. Much like the horror Red Hook, he is set in a realistic New York City. The entire narrative takes place within Greenwich Village, and the story concludes with the narrator found broken and bloody, quote, at the entrance of a little black court off Perry Street, end quote. And that would have been 93 Perry Street. Next slide. This is a close-up of the entrance to that little black court. The building was refaced in the 1940s, so it would have looked differently in Lovecraft's time. Next slide. The final story we'll talk about tonight, and the final story, which Lovecraft wrote while living in New York City, was Cool Air. Cool Air was written in the early months of 1926, and it is another tale told from the point of view of a man of letters depressed by his inability to achieve literary success in New York. Due to his deepening poverty, the narrator resorts to renting a room in a boarding house on West 14th Street in the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan. Eventually, he befriends his upstairs neighbor, a mysterious doctor and scientist who insists on running an industrial air conditioner and professes knowledge of necromancy. The narrator sees his new friend as a like-minded, cultured, and educated person stranded amid the squalor of New York City. Next slide. Much like the horror Red Hook, and much like Cool Air takes place within New York City. That is a realistic New York City. And the story almost entirely occurs within the confines of a boarding house. That boarding house was inspired by this building, 317 West 14th Street. Lovecraft's friend, the bookseller George Kirk, who we've met on several occasions tonight, rented a pair of rooms on the ground floor of the building for a period in 1925. He operated his business, the Chelsea Bookshop, within the street-facing room, and he lived in the room directly behind that one. These two rooms served as the de facto headquarters for Kirk and Lovecraft's writing circle at Calum Club. And here is how Lovecraft described his friend's building. It is, quote, "It is a typical Victorian home of New York's Age of Innocence, with tiled hall, carved marble mantels, incredibly high ceilings covered with stucco ornamentation, round arched doorways with elaborate Rococo pediments, and all the earmarks of New York's age of vast wealth and impossible taste," end quote. And today a small hotel operates within the building. While Lovecraft was putting the final touches on his draft of Cool Air, he was plotting his escape from New York. In April 1926, he boarded a train and returned to his native Providence, where he would live for the remainder of his life. At this time, he was completely disenchanted with New York City, and he never ceased loathing it and what it represented to him, which was a diverse and modern metropolis. After years of a long-distance relationship, Sonia Green, that's Lovecraft's long-suffering wife, if you remember, and Lovecraft were divorced in 1929. There is some debate over the legal finality of that act. I have my own research and conclusions, and you can read them in my book. Regardless of his distaste for New York, Lovecraft would return to the city most years to celebrate part of the Christmas season and the New Year with his friends. Although Lovecraft considered his New York experiences little more than, quote, "the merest vague dream," end quote, his time in the city allowed him to develop as an individual and as a writer. In New York, he forged friendships which would last a lifetime. In New York, he honed a literary voice heard in his best fiction. Next slide. Thank you so much, and I'm excited to hear your questions about H.P. Lovecraft and Gotham. Do we have any questions, impressions, insults? Yes, sir.
Would it be fair to give Lovecraft's stay at the Clinton address as the same type of misery his character experiences in The Dreams of the Witch's House?
Oh, that is a great question. I had I have not thought about that. I am going to have to reread that story. I have not read that in the last year. But that's an interesting parallel. I mean, I'm looking at his New York stories and seeing how his experiences inform them. So I see he and Kulera's fairly honest and not particularly well masked critiques or explorations of his time at Clinton Street. But that's a great question. The dream. I'll have to read the story, and then I could answer that question more fully. But what do you think?
I can see it because it's about the coldness, the sickness, the underlying madness that the character goes under. And even he says, why wouldn't I move? The rent is cheap.
Mm-hmm. I'm definitely going to read that story this week now because I need to be able to answer that more fully if it comes up again. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Did his views on New York ever change as he grew older? It always remained that maybe.
That is an excellent question, and I can answer. That's one I can answer with some assurance. So the answer to that is no. When he moved back to Providence in 1926, he wrote a letter to his friend Frank Belknap Long, and I'm paraphrasing it. I quote it fully in my book. And he talks about I'll never forget the sunsets over Central Park or the Japanese in Hill Pond and Brooklyn Botanic Garden. But effectively, I hate New York. And he would, as I mentioned, he'd travel to New York at least once a year to see friends. He had very good friends here, Frank Belknap Long, who we met, James Morton, who we met, was living in Patterson. He had another group of friends that lived in the Village that were part of the Bohemian scene there, which Lovecraft never was. But after he died, they were clearing out the papers on his desk, and they found a letter to James Morton, who again, he was friends with in New York, who lived in Patterson. In that letter, on 2 occasions, he refers to New York as the pest zone. And that was his nickname for New York, the pest zone. So even while he was dying, he could not mitigate his hatred for the city. I wish I could say otherwise, but I can't. Any other questions, impressions?
So you mentioned that, like a lot of writers, he was, poorly paid for his work, but it continues to be adapted today. So 2-part question. One is, who owns or controls the rights to his work, and are they still earning money from, adaptations of it? And second part is, what do you think is the best, say, film or television adaptation of Lovecraft work?
Okay, so the first one is very simple and not objective at all. Or subjective. It's not subjective, I should say. His work's all public domain. So if anyone here is an aspiring filmmaker, have at it. You can make your own Lovecraft film or television show or play, novel, song. But what do I feel is the strongest adaptation? So earlier we saw a poster for John Carpenter's The Thing. Even though that's not a pure adaptation, I would say that's the closest we'll get to a straight Lovecraft film, probably, at least in my lifetime. I know Guillermo del Toro, for the last decade, has been trying to make At the Mountains of Madness. That seems like a rather chaotic endeavor. I don't see it happening, but I hope it does. His works in many ways, his works in many ways are Lovecraft works. If you look at them, just the fantastical quality and the strange sense of the other. But those are my thoughts. Oh, yeah.
In your book, you go through an enormous amount of speculation about his relationships with other people, including his mother and possible hypochondria, and his relationship to his wife over time. And you mention queerness on many occasions, and other people describing him as a queer person and his placement in queer places, especially in the Village, but you don't really characterize him as such and don't go into more depth about that. What sources did you use to make that decision throughout your work?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, thank you for reading the book, and I'm glad that you read it, and it sounds as if you got some positive things out of it. But as you mentioned, and as we talked about already, there were queer individuals in Lovecraft's social circle, and he was in spaces such as the Double R, where he certainly crossed paths with queer men and queer women. And there has developed a school of thought that Lovecraft's sexuality might be a little more cloudy than he might have himself described it. However, there doesn't seem to be evidence to support that. And what sources did I use to draw these conclusions? One, I leaned heavily on his letters. I leaned on memoirs by his various friends. Also, the letters and writings of his wife that do exist, and those are few, but there does seem to be a strong and healthy sexual relationship between the two, even though later she classified Lovecraft as, say, for lack of better terms, a cold fish, or we might think of as aromantic now. Also, I think the mischaracterization of Lovecraft as possibly queer originated from Samuel Loveman. So there is a collection of letters from Samuel Loveman, who we met, and for those who don't remember, he was a poet living in New York. He was good friends with Lovecraft. In the 1970s, Loveman was corresponding with Alfred Galpin, who was another friend of Lovecraft's, who was not a New Yorker, but he does make appearance in my book. And Loveman, and I'm paraphrasing, speculates that some of what we might think of now as homophobic comments Lovecraft made were a mask for his own unsure sexuality. And that's where I think that misconception sprung from, are those letters. Because there doesn't seem any evidence in other documents of Lovecraft's life of him questioning his sexuality, experimenting with his sexuality. There's a great novel by Paul Lafarge, the late novelist, who died early this year, last year I believe, called The Night Ocean. And that's exploring Lovecraft's relationship with Robert Barlow. So Robert Barlow was Lovecraft's executor. He was much younger than Lovecraft. He was also a gay man. He, sadly enough, committed suicide when he was, for lack of a term, being blackmailed about his sexuality in Mexico City. But in that novel, it sort of explores this possibility that Lovecraft was gay, but part of the novel also reveals that it is mythology. So it's an interesting book. So I'm sorry for the discursive answer. Did that help? Did that make sense at all? Or no? I'm happy to go further if you would like me to.
No, it's all right.
Yeah.
I expected in the book, since it is mentioned so many times, to tie into the relation to the rest of the xenophobia, especially in his work, because most of the perspectives in his work suggest xenophobia not only of other ethnicities, races, sexualities, but also just of the world in general as a way to comprehend the world. And it didn't, it felt a little bit disjointed to not see those joined together.
Well, in Lovecraft's letters, there's only, I'd say under half a dozen, we'll say, instances of him expressing any real homophobia. So it is it's a rare occasion. But what I would say, and I'm not defending Lovecraft, that's not what I see as my job, is that he seemed to be very forgiving of the people he knew. So he certainly knew Hart Crane was gay. In his letters to his aunts, he bemoans the fact that Hart Crane was an alcoholic. He saw Hart Crane as possibly the most talented poet or literary person he'd ever met, and he saw Hart Crane as drinking himself into an early grave. But he also talked about his morality, and we have to read between the lines to determine what that means, but I think it's fair to say he was criticizing Hart Crane's sexual orientation. Also Samuel Loveman, who we've been talking about, in one of his memoirs on Lovecraft, he mentions that Lovecraft was always forgiving of, and the term he uses, picadillos, the picadillos of his friends. So that tells me that Lovecraft likely knew that his friend Loveman was gay, and it wasn't a factor in their friendship. But getting to your point and your critique that it wasn't maybe as prominent as his xenophobia is, the reason why is I don't feel is as prominent in his own life and his own work as his xenophobia. But I'm happy to be proven otherwise. Other questions? Comments?
Actually,
Yeah.
you mentioned that there seems to be sort of a disconnect between his sort of xenophobia and his personal
Yes.
connections. How did, obviously, people who had read his work, who were his friends, react to what he was writing that might have seemed either sort of insensitive or hurtful?
I haven't encountered much evidence of that. It is one of those great questions because his racism, his anti-Semitism wasn't a secret. This wasn't as if he only told one person these certain things, then he told someone something else. I do know that Morton attempted to persuade him to believe more better things, the things that would be more harmonious with probably most of our own beliefs. And this is one of the great facts that I think will always bedevil Lovecraft readers and scholars, is that Lovecraft prided himself as being changeable, that he was always open to argument, he's open to be persuaded to new ideas. And we see him taking various positions on different things throughout his life. But the one constant was his views on race and ethnicity. That never changed. And there were like fine gradations, possibly, but effectively it was consistent throughout his life. We do know that Samuel Loveman, who we've been talking about, wrote an essay on Lovecraft in the 70s decrying him because of his anti-Semitism. And Loveman claimed that he only learned of Lovecraft's anti-Semitism later in his life, which was patently false. If you go through the papers and memoirs, like he was aware that Lovecraft was anti-Semitic, or at least maybe not to Loveman personally, but among other people. My reading of Loveman's letters and critiques is whether it's possibly alluding to Lovecraft being queer or casting him out because of his anti-Semitism, is that Loveman was jealous in the 70s that his work was forgotten. Loveman was a poet, and in the 70s, Lovecraft's reputation was on the ascendancy. And the only reason we know Samuel Loveman today is because of his relationship with Lovecraft. And in those letters I mentioned, written by Samuel Loveman, he goes into that, bemoaning, like, why is no one reading my work? Why are they reading Lovecraft? And I think that might have been his motivation, either consciously or subconsciously. But how did other people react? I mean, his wife wrote about it a bit in her memoir on him, saying she would criticize him and say, don't you realize I'm one of these people you're talking about? But also, Lovecraft's friends claim that he was always polite and personable with anyone he ever encountered. So he never would say these things to someone's face. I do wonder if there was a bit of, what's the term? As Lovecraft's reputation was growing in the 60s and 70s, many of the people that were his friends that were surviving, such as Frank Belknap Long, they had their own careers and reputations to worry about. So there might have been a remaking of history in the sense, oh, we never heard him say these things, but they probably did. But they had their own names to worry about at this time, and they needed to insulate themselves from those charges. But that's one of the questions, and what I think I try to tease out in the book is here's this great contradiction. The fact that Sonia Green first visits him in Providence in the fall of 1921. And he's writing to Reinhard Kleiner, who was a Bushwick. He lived in Bushwick. He was a poet, a mutual friend of Green and Lovecraft. He eventually became part of the Calum Club, which we talked about, Lovecraft's writing circle. And he's writing to Kleiner, telling about how Green visits him in Providence. And it's clearly he's interested in Green. He has feelings towards her. And oh, she's so smart. She's so intelligent. But then he qualifies it, like, oh, for a Slav or for a Semite. So, as I said, it's bedeviling, and I don't have a strong answer, and I think that's one of the questions we'll always be asking ourselves about him. Yes?
In a lot of his writings, he talks about the horrific architecture that he encounters. Is New York in any way, shape, or form a basis for some of the non-Euclidean geometry that he is so terrified of in his stories?
I think so. And actually, I didn't even make that connection until after the book came out. I was sitting down with a friend of mine who was interviewing me for a piece he was writing on cosmic horror and Dracula. And we were chatting, and he asked, how did New York inform the Cthulhu mythos? And I said, actually, if you look at the language, how he describes the cities at the Mountains of Madness, or Cthulhu's island in the Call of Cthulhu, some of the terms we see in his New York stories, like the term cyclopean, the way he described Manhattan skyline, that comes up again and again and again in his work. So, yes, I think that is the case, and I wish that I had made that connection before I finished the book. But yes?
Why did you choose to write this book?
Oh, that's a great question. So in 2018, my first book had come out in 2017, and I had been promoting that, and I had some downtime, and I read an article about how Lovecraft enjoyed visiting Elizabeth, New Jersey when living in New York. I found that very puzzling. Why Elizabeth, New Jersey? So a friend and I traveled to Elizabeth, New Jersey on a freezing cold day, and we had what we thought was Lovecraft's itinerary. I found the guidebook that I thought he used to walk through Elizabeth the first time. And we took pictures when our cameras were not freezing up, or our phones were not freezing up. And then I began just reading more about his New York years. I thought I was going to write something about Lovecraft in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And that didn't pan out. And the more I read, the more I thought, there's a much larger story here. There's a book here. And I spent the next 5 years reading about Lovecraft, reading about New York City, reading about the 1920s, and writing, and editing, and editing, and editing, and rewriting. And now we have the book. And I was always fascinated by Lovecraft since my teen years, too. So in the back of my mind, I always had this hidden hope that I'd write about him. So it did come true. Any other questions, comments, concerns?
Would you say that the basis of Lovecraft's work in general is just that he didn't understand a lot, and the fear of anything new was what really drove his characters to madness, as opposed to a more open mind, such as with his xenophobia and encountering, and his stories where his characters are encountering like Dagon,
right,
or Cthulhu itself, or any of the other cosmic beasts like the star beasts.
Mm-hmm. A fear of the novel. That's what you arguing is what motivated him.
Yeah, that's what I would.
Possibly. It's interesting that I think there's definitely some truth to that. That he was afraid of the world changing around him. Also, I think either consciously or subconsciously, his own failures informed these fears. In the sense that he was born into this family of diminishing fortunes. They were sort of shabby Yankee gentry. He probably assumed, or he was told, he was going to have this sort of leisurely life of education and knowledge. He was supposed to go to Brown probably, and that didn't happen. So he's a person that things did not happen to. So maybe like Bartleby the Scrivener, right? So I think his own private sense of frustration fueled that. But I think you're correct in the sense that the fear of the new America, the emerging America, this America of people with funny last names, funny complexions, that terrified him. And I mean, unfortunately, we're seeing that in our own times. When I wrote this book, I started this in 2018, so this is 2 years in the Donald Trump presidency. I did not think some of the issues that I would be talking about would be as real as they are now. I think if this book came out 10 years ago, some of the things that Lovecraft said, some of the things that Lovecraft wrote would seem sort of absurd, but now we see them as echoed in our own day. So, yes, so I apologize for that long-winded response. Yes?
Just to follow up on that, given the audience here in this venue, I mean, you can also relate it to historic preservation, even today. I mean, I forgot fear of the new, but yeah, I mean, I think aside from fear of the other and ethnicity, but they're a little bit interrelated is, his views on preserving the colonial past, which this organization that sponsored this talk largely is about, and preventing the new from coming into these idealized worlds. More of a comment, but
No, that's fine. No, but he valued space, and especially historic colonial space. And in his letters to his aunts, they're always talking about buildings that are threatened in Providence or buildings that were lost in Providence. And that is one of the many reasons you should check out his letters. He really is fascinated and has a love of space and history. And Lovecraft would say, Lovecraft in a way was a proto-absurdist, so he thought there was no meaning to life. There's nothing, there's no God, there's no heaven, there's no ethical code that cements us together. But he found value in history. He found value in the 18th century in preserving these spaces, promoting these spaces. But he would say, that's what gives my life value, but that doesn't mean it's a universal value. So.
I read a little bit on Wikipedia.
That's fine.
About him, because I realized I really knew nothing.
That's why you came here tonight.
Yes, that's exactly right. But one of the things with the direction of this discussion is it struck me when I read this great account, and it's so brief, so now I'm afraid of your longer book, but his father died in an insane asylum, and frankly, so did his mother. And it struck me, and it mentioned the racism and the xenophobic musings of his, but it struck me that was as much of a driver of the uncontrollable world out there that would make someone crazy, and as opposed more. I like the insights that are being shared, but I wanted to throw that out to see what your thoughts were. And it's been suspected, and I'm not sure what the source would be per se, that his father actually died of syphilis. So, and I don't know whether his mother also had syphilis, and even whether he had syphilis or whatever. I don't know much about syphilis, but I do know that it can be transmitted even to children and certainly to partners. So do you know whether that was true, but also
his mother, we don't know. Her records were destroyed in a fire. I was able to discover who her physician was, but knowing the episodes that were documented about his mother, I think it would be fair to suspect that's the case. So his mother entered Butler Hospital in 1919, but she clearly was suffering long before then. And there are accounts of her acting very odd. One being that she was working outside in the garden or cutting shrubs or something like that, and she ran up to a neighbor and said how monsters were darting out of corners of the bushes and the trees at her. Also that she suffered some sort of panic attack on a trolley and rushed out. Another neighbor remembers hearing Lovecraft and his mother screaming at one another on a regular basis, and when she asked Lovecraft about it, because of course she was concerned, he said, oh, no. We were just practicing Shakespeare plays together. So anyone that's ever lived in a household with substance abuse or mental illness knows that often people create these public stories, right, to excuse the happenings. So we don't know how that might have scarred Lovecraft, but I think it certainly did. We know that his mother purportedly tormented him about his looks. He's horrid to look at, he's ugly. She would tell neighbors and friends this. And if you remember the image of the family, who does he look like? He looks like his mother. So we don't know what sort of trauma that imprinted on him, but it certainly did. And I think your comment is correct that it did inform his fiction. So one theme we see in his work is hereditary madness. So one of my favorite Lovecraft stories is The Shadow Over Innsmouth. And there's a character, the main character mentions there's a cousin in an insane asylum. They don't know why he was locked up. And the main character ends in the same place. So, I mean, the joke among Lovecraft readers, and it's really a shared truth, is that every character in this story either dies or goes insane. So, I mean, madness is clearly a theme. But Lovecraft himself did not have syphilis. So there was a scholar by the name, I believe, of Robert Price at some point was able to access Lovecraft's medical records. And I believe it's called a Wasserman test, I think that's the name. Don't quote me, I'm not a scholar of medical history, I'm not a physician. That determines whether you have syphilis or inherited. I was not able to access those records. I found the reference number to them, but the laws have changed. Now due to HIPAA, I can't access them. So yes, you're correct that madness informed his work. His father had syphilis, his mother, in all likelihood, did. Lovecraft did not, as far as we know.
I'm sorry, I arrived late. So
That's okay, don't worry about
it.
it.
This was asked.
Don't worry about it.
What did he die of?
He died of cancer, small intestine. And by all accounts, fairly horrific death. Actually, the book concludes with this. Lovecraft had a fear of physicians and doctors. This may have been an outgrowth of both his parents, having been committed and perished in a mental health facility. He also was poor, so he didn't have health insurance. I don't even know if there was health insurance back in 1937 when he died. So he might have avoided going to the doctor until it was too late. But by the time, he was complaining for about a year and a half of different symptoms, which collectively may have suggested he was suffering from cancer for some time. But cancer of the small intestine.
Thank you.
And he was 46 years old, so he died in 1937, so before his 47th birthday. Any other questions, responses, comments? Complaints? Wait, yes?
Not a complaint.
Well, I can take it. That's all right.
I had to step out a couple of times, so
Don't worry about it.
I apologize if
No, that's okay.
we went over this already, but I was just wondering how much time he may have spent in Red Hook, by any chance, while he...
How much he timed it?
Yes.
Well, that's a good question because I couldn't determine that. So one, for those who don't know, Red Hook, the geography of Brooklyn was defined a bit differently in the 1920s. So Red Hook may have, depending on who was describing it, could have extended all the way up to maybe Atlantic Avenue at that time.
Okay.
So Carroll Gardens area would definitely be part of Red Hook. We don't know how much time he spent there, but in his diary and in a recollection by his friend George Kirk, the bookseller who we talked about a few times, they mentioned going on a walking trip through Red Hook one day and Gowanus. So we know at least one day or 2 days. But again, the geography of Brooklyn was very different than it is today. So if you asked him on a certain day, he might even said, "Oh, I live on the outer borders of Red Hook." But we don't know. We don't have a firm answer.
Okay. Sorry, please, go ahead.
No.
I believe he wrote a story that...
Horror at Red Hook.
Yes.
Yes, we talked about that.
Yep.
And that's in the book, and I'll be happy to.
Sure.
He wrote a story, Horror at Red Hook, written in August 1925 in New York City. Any other questions, comments? Yes?
Final comment is
No,
that
you're not.
in 2019, The Color Out of Space was turned into a film starring Nicolas Cage.
Yep.
So, if you ever watched that.
I have not watched that one, but that's one of my favorite stories by Lovecraft. Any other questions or comments? No? I have some books for sale tonight if you're interested in purchasing copies. Again, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Village Preservation, for organizing it, and thank you for St. Mark's for hosting.